The mission is simple: to help high achievers naturally eliminate emotional and physical obstacles so they can optimize their life for higher achievement. Welcome. You have just entered the Genesis Zone. Hello, good day, and welcome to the Genesis Zone show. This is Dr. Brian Brown. Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us. I know there are a million places you could be and a million things you could be doing, and we appreciate you being here. You're in for an amazing treat today. In our ongoing Wellness Warriors series, today we're joined by Manya Chylinski. Manya is a communication specialist and survivor of the Boston Marathon bombing. She helps people whose lives have been touched by trauma to understand how resiliency and compassion are part of the path of healing, which enables them to live their best lives. She's an entrepreneur who uses her experience as a survivor to help others understand the importance of trauma-sensitive leadership and recognizing the psychological impacts of violence. Her story and insights have been shared in the Boston Globe, the Buffalo News, on NPR's All Things Considered, and Self magazine. She is a powerful voice and advocate for validating the invisible victims of trauma on stages, from the International Association of Business Communicators World Conference to the Pennsylvania Governor's Emergency Management Conference to the National Homeland Security Conference and South by Southwest 2019. In this Overcomers segment, Manya will be sharing her experiences in the area of resilient living. Manya, welcome. So glad to have you here today. How are you doing?
Hi, Brian. I'm doing great today, and I'm thrilled to be here talking with you about this really important topic.
Awesome. So, just right there in your bio, you were a survivor of the Boston Marathon bombing. And anybody who's been around for any length of time remembers that and how tragic that was. Tell us a little bit about, life in Boston up until that point, like how long you'd lived there, what life was like, and it just, kind of everyday routine. And then lead us into that story and kind of share what happened that day.
Sure. So at that point, I'd lived in Boston just around 20 years or so, and I live not far from the finish line. So Marathon Day was always something special, just in part because they closed down this part of the city, for a few days ahead of time to get ready for it. I, worked for myself at that time. I actually still do. I work as a writer. I do marketing, reports, research, that kind of stuff. And, I was just kind of living a regular life, had my routine, had my group of friends. And, looking back, I think in some ways I was just kind of going through the motions. Obviously, that wasn't something I realized at the time, but then after the bombing, started kind of examining what was going on in my life and realized I had gotten kind of stuck in a rut.
Yeah, awesome. So the day of the marathon bombing, do you recall like memories from that day, like what was going on that morning? Because obviously if you're there at the finish line, it takes a while for runners to move through the course. At least the elite runners, 2-3 hours, somewhere along in there. Yeah.
So that year was special because a friend got us tickets for the bleacher seats, which are right at the finish line.
Oh, wow.
And, it's about the closest you can be unless you're an official who's actually tracking the runners as they come in.
Yeah.
And so that was super exciting. And our passes were actually good for 2:00 on.
Oh, wow.
So in the morning, I did what I normally did on Marathon Day. So first of all, I always took the day off of work so I could just be part of this big party, really.
Just celebration, yeah.
Yeah, it's just a celebration of life, and it's so
Mhm.
amazing to watch these runners as they get close to the finish line. And I am not a runner. I just enjoyed the marathon because it was this great event that was happening in my city.
Mm.
And I got out there in the morning to watch the first elite runners, and the wheelchair runners finish their race. And got out there and in the crowd and was cheering and having a great time. And then my friends and I met up for lunch and then to walk over to get into the bleacher seats for 2 o'clock.
Oh, wow.
And there lots of streets and things are closed off. So even though where we met for lunch was incredibly close to where the bleachers are, we actually had quite a far way to walk to kind of go
Mhm.
around everything and get there. We got there, we got ourselves settled in about 2 o'clock. We showed our passes. We were told not to bring any bags, not to,
Mm.
kind of, we
Yeah.
did have to go through security. And then we settled in, and it was great to be watching the runners. You could actually see them from where we were standing. We could actually see them cross the finish line. We could see the steps over the finish line. And it's really exciting to be that close to the finish and hearing the announcer calling people's names out as they stepped over the line is just a real party atmosphere.
And just cheering them on as you're there as a spectator, right?
Yes, sort of a semi-professional, spectator cheering on, and I remember thinking earlier that day that I should get myself a cowbell. People use those, and it gets so hard after a while to just be clapping,
Yeah.
and it doesn't feel like that's making enough noise. Like,
Wow.
that's how exciting it is to watch these folks coming over the finish line, and, some people get to the finish line and they're struggling because it is a
Mm.
really long way to run,
Mm.
and it feels like as a spectator, that's cheering and yelling and hopefully carries them those last steps if they need some
Yeah.
help.
Yeah. Awesome. That's awesome. So, where were you around the time of the bomb actually going off? Were you standing right there where the runners were coming by, like right on the front, or what?
So we were standing in the bleacher seats, and to be clear, even though they're seats, everybody stands up, and
Yeah,
which means
because
then
once one person stands up, everybody's got to stand.
exactly, because you
Yeah,
can't see a thing.
yeah.
So we were all standing there in the bleacher seats, and we were probably I was there with several friends, and we were probably maybe 5 rows up,
Mm.
um, and that's where I was standing when the first bomb exploded directly across the street from where we were.
Wow.
And I was, as it happens, looking directly at that spot when the bomb
Mm.
exploded.
Mm.
And for reasons I will never understand, I knew it was a bomb. I
Mm.
heard in the days and, weeks after other people's experience, and many people didn't think it was a bomb. They
Right.
wondered if it was a gas line explosion and a, manhole cover or a water cannon. Um, for some reason, I knew it was a bomb, and in my
Mm.
head, I thought, "They just ruined the Boston Marathon."
Mm.
I knew it
Mm.
was bad. Somehow I knew this was caused by somebody. This wasn't just some sort of accident.
Mm. 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 And what happened in those seconds and moments right after the bomb went off?
I was frozen in place.
Mm.
My entire world collapsed to just be this tunnel vision looking across the street at the the remnants of the bomb. So the
Mm.
cloud of smoke getting bigger and,
Mm.
the other side of the street had been filled with people and colorful, and there's a fence between the course and the crowd, and high above that fence were, the flags of the world. So,
Mm.
whole other side from my view is this just colorful party and people cheering, and now it wasn't,
Mm.
and I it looked to me like people were kind of running away like, ripples on a pond,
mm,
and then, in my mind, there was nobody across the street,
mm,
and I could not hear anything. I couldn't feel anything. If you had tapped me at that moment and asked me,
mm,
I would have told you I was standing there alone.
mm,
And as I was looking across the street and my brain is trying to process this,
mm,
I turned a little bit to my left and I saw this woman standing in front of a shattered plate glass window.
mm,
And so it was all dark behind her, looking into the business that was there. And little bits of glass were still in the frame. So it kind of framed
right.
her. And again, I wasn't having a lot of what I would describe as conscious thoughts, but the thought I did have was, how is it possible that this woman is standing there and she does not appear to be physically hurt?
Mm,
I don't understand how that can happen. And as I'm trying to click this over in my brain and trying to wrap my head around it, the second bomb goes off
mm,
to my left. And I turned to look down the street and saw the smoke rising and just was overcome with this feeling of,
mm,
where am I?
mm,
Like, this isn't my neighborhood. I don't know what's happening here.
mm,
And that's when I had the thought, I think we have to get out of here. And
mm,
said that to my friend, although I don't remember saying it. She told me later that I said it. And then we evacuated the bleachers, which meant that as we went down the stairs, we actually were getting closer to the first bombing site.
right.
I just looked straight down at my feet and I never looked back up until we got around the corner and um, away from the scene. That was not a conscious decision. My brain just knew, let's not look at what's across the street.
Right. 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 So, obviously, well, not obviously, I don't know. Did you go home at that point, and kind of regroup, or what happened next?
As I was evacuating, I ran into one of the friends that I was with. We had both decided that the shortest way to the exit of the bleachers was a straight line between where we were standing and the top of the staircase to get down, which meant we were stepping over all of the other seats.
Mm,
Some of my other friends went out the more normal way, which is they walked along our row till they got to the staircase and went down.
right.
So by the time we got around the corner, my friend and I realized that had been separated from our other friends.
Mm,
So we didn't want to be too close to the where the bomb went off, because obviously we didn't know what was happening. We
mm,
went a few blocks away and texted our friends, and eventually we all met up. And, for a little while, we just stood around outside trying
mm,
to get our heads around what was happening.
mhm,
And other people were asking us if we knew what had happened, because anybody in the area obviously understood something was happening, but not everybody saw, for example, like we did, the bombs go off.
right. Right.
So we
Yeah,
were
I remember, on the news, they were saying possibly a gas main had exploded. Nobody really knew at that point. So I guess down on the ground level, it was the same thing, but probably more magnified.
yes, and
Yeah.
people were very scared, and I think I've always kind of thought to myself that, on one hand, one of the fears I didn't have was that not knowing what happened. I think sometimes when you don't know what happened, it's even more frightening
Right.
because you don't have kind of a bucket to put it into. So we did our best to explain to people what we thought was going on. Some people had runners who had been on the course and were asking, did we think any runners were hurt? How did, what were our thoughts about that? Um, so it was really speculation on our part, but we did our best. And
Right.
a couple of people wanted to borrow our phones. We texted people for them. It was just this odd experience of
Mm,
this horrible thing has happened. We don't know what to do. We don't really want to go home yet. My friends and I were all very afraid of going inside a building, which is funny to me because we were outside when the bomb went off.
Mhm.
Somehow it didn't feel safe to go inside a building.
Mhm.
And eventually we decided we should probably just go home. We'd started to hear the news. We knew that 3 individuals had been killed essentially instantly.
Mm.
And we knew that obviously many people were very severely physically injured. And they closed off the course and the crime scene, so we had another long distance
Mm.
to get ourselves home. And
Mm.
now there was a big police presence and sirens and ambulances that were taking people to hospitals. And when I got home, I sat down on my couch and turned on the news because I had no idea what was going on. I mean,
Mm.
I saw it, but I also had no idea what was happening,
Mm.
and, stayed glued to the news that
Mm.
night for sure.
Right. Right. So in the preceding days, what was life like? What how did you transition back into normal life, if there is such a thing, after being a part of a terrorist attack? What was life like in those coming days?
I did not transition back very quickly, can
Mm.
tell you that much. In those first few days, I was under a lot of distress. I was stunned, I was scared, I was confused, and I think a lot of people in the city and maybe outside the city, can understand those feelings, because just so confusing to think that this has happened and that somebody decided to do this
Mm.
and kind of conceptualize the whole thing. And life didn't get back to normal for sure for that first week. They were still looking for the perpetrators. That was a big um, piece of the news story, because
Mm.
obviously you wanted to figure out what had happened. Are we at risk for more of this kind of thing?
Mm.
And so while I was dealing with the distress and fear and anxiety that was caused by all of this, the press for the world was camped out in my neighborhood. And I
Mm.
walked past Wolf Blitzer one day, and from my front steps I could see Anderson Cooper live on the air reporting the
Mm.
story. And I'm sure that I walked past well-known names from world news
Mm.
stations that I just didn't know who they were.
Mhm.
And the street, Boylston Street, was closed off for many, many blocks for at least 7, I think maybe 10 days. So
Wow.
life in the neighborhood couldn't get back to normal, at least for a first couple weeks,
Mm.
because the way Boston is laid out, Boylston Street is this major commercial street, and on one side is essentially the large, residential neighborhood. And
Right.
anything that we wanna do, like go shopping or go to the grocery store or go to the doctor's office, is on the other side of Boylston Street. So
Mm.
everybody kind of, even if you didn't really know what was happening, you couldn't get away from it because the
Right.
crime scene was
It
closed.
was right there in your face all the time.
It was right there when there were police officers at each of the cross streets
Yeah.
preventing people from going in. So it
Yeah.
was very present in the neighborhood for at least a week and a half.
Yeah. And during that time frame, were there any physical symptoms that you noticed, like, headache, disorientation, dizziness, tremors, anything like that that was occurring, that you thought, man, this is not me?
The first day after, so the next day, Tuesday, I I didn't really know what to do. What do you
Mm.
do after something like that happens? So I
Mm.
just went to my office and turned on my computer and went to work, and
Mm.
had you know, a conference call for a project I was working on, and I figured I should just get right back into it. While I was on this conference call, I was overcome with the smell of the bomb.
Mm,
Now, if you had asked me before that if I smelled the bomb, I would have said no.
mm,
What do you mean? But I obviously had, and as I'm sitting on this call, I was overcome with the smell of the bomb, and my whole body froze, and I could feel my heart beating, out of my chest, and the logical part of my brain kept saying, "I don't see any fire. I don't hear any sirens. I think it's okay." But my body was still reacting like the bomb had gone off again.
right. And on some level, you were physically re-experiencing that, and
Absolutely.
there'd been a trigger of some kind that did it, and you didn't even know what that trigger was.
Yes, and I figured out what that trigger was later that day. I
Mm,
left my apartment to go for a walk, and I stopped one of the police officers who was guarding the crime scene, and I said, "You know, can you still smell it? Is the smell still in the air, like, in the neighborhood? Is that why I'm still smelling it? Because, I live close enough?" And he said, "No, he didn't smell it, it wasn't." And then he started telling me a story about one of his friends who had been close to the bomb the day before and had gone home and showered and showered and showered and showered and didn't feel like he could get the smell out of his hair.
right.
And I realized, for no reason that I can tell you, I put on the exact same clothes the next day.
Wow.
So I put on clothes that smelled like the bomb.
Right.
Just sort of took me a little bit wearing them before I actually sensed that.
Mm, mm,
Um, I as soon as I realized that, I quickly went home and took them off and, uh, washed them, and actually not very long after, just got rid of them.
right. Right. Awesome. Thank you for sharing that. That's a wow. It's a tough story. Um, um, from an emotional, mental standpoint, we talked about the physical symptoms that you were seeing days, weeks after. What kind of emotional or mental impact do you feel like it had in those immediate, 10 to 14 days after the bombing?
It was, in some ways, the only thing going on in my life. I
Mm,
was so distressed, and I didn't really understand what was happening to me. I'm have always been one of those people who, if I can intellectualize what's happening, if you can explain to me what's happening,
mm,
then I can I may not be happy about it, but I can deal with it.
mm,
And I was not able to do that at all. And I was having trouble sleeping, and when I did sleep, I was having nightmares, and
mm,
I was not doing a great job of self-care.
mm,
You I will would be too embarrassed to tell you what I ate for most of that week,
mhm,
and, really a lot of anxiety, and, I honestly don't know if I was a particularly anxious person before, but I definitely have dealt with anxiety, in the 8 years since, and
since then, yeah,
in those first few days and weeks, it was sort of the only thing that I was the only thing I was experiencing.
yeah,
And I actually called my doctor's office the Monday after, so 1 week after, and asked to come in and see somebody in their behavioral health department. I was so confused and anxious and
mm,
unable to really function. I just didn't know what else to do. And, I'd been to therapy in the past, and I felt like this person could understand. And
right,
that's when I discovered there is such a thing as an emergency mental health care appointment. When
mm,
I told them why I wanted to come in, they got me in the next day at lunchtime.
right. Within 24 hours, yeah,
Yeah, it was
that's
amazing.
awesome. That's awesome. Um, very good, very good. So, when did you start seeing, I guess, for a lack of a better analogy, the cloud to kind of start lifting where you could get perspective, and start to turn the corner and start to get that healing?
It took a while.
Mm,
I It's hard to kind of pinpoint it, right? You have to sort of look back and think, how did
mhm,
that work out for me. But I would say that for the first year for sure, and probably the first couple of years, I I just was going through the motions.
Right.
And, I was able to continue working and live my life and all of that. But
Would you use the word numb? Just kind of felt numb, kind of going through the motions?
absolutely felt
Yeah.
numb, and that has actually been a challenge for me this entire time. I still
Really?
have times when I feel numb, and I recognize now I'm able to kind of recognize it's because for some reason right now I can't process this.
Mm.
So I need to kind of create some sort of distance. But I was definitely numb for those first couple years. And looking back, I would say maybe 2.5 years out is when I started to feel like some of the work I've been doing in therapy and with trauma counselors, I started to see pieces of myself,
Mhm.
what I would have called my old self, but, weren't really. The goal wasn't really to get back to who I was before, but, I didn't so much of the time early on, I wasn't able to step outside myself and think about what was happening. I just was living and doing what I needed to survive.
Mm.
And it was only later that I started to recognize, oh, this work that I did here is enabling me to do this and
Mm.
work on my anxiety and be able to recognize when I'm triggered or when I start feeling anxious about something. And then I would know the steps to take to mitigate that.
Mm.
But the kind of meta level of awareness definitely took a while. And, it sounds to my own ears just so strange to say that it took years, but I think it
Mm.
did.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, no, I mean, I think in so many respects, trauma victims, whether they be trauma victims of physical injury or bystander type injury, they all have very similar responses, and I think that's one of the most confusing things for people in general as well as health professionals. Did you find that there was a difference be over how around how you were treated, even though you didn't have physical injuries? Like, were you treated differently than somebody that had physical injuries versus the bystander? I witnessed this. I was in the middle of it type of an injury.
Yes, definitely treated differently. The public response, the city bringing resources to bear, the state bringing resources to bear, private entities creating a privately funded victim compensation fund. M- The majority of these, not all, but the majority of those responses focused entirely on the people who had physical impacts,
Physical injuries.
the bereaved families and the folks with the physical injuries. And our state office of victim assistance was kind of the lone holdout in that they absolutely recognized immediately that there were going to be mental health impacts for people who didn't have physical injuries. And
Mm.
getting myself kind of hooked into that system was very, very helpful. Um, but the public focus, and if you look at the news stories and you look at how the city leaders talked about it, the focus was entirely on the physical impacts. And I know
Mm.
personally now many people for whom it took years after
Mm.
bombing to for them to recognize that what happened to them was real and it was
Yeah.
distress and it was
Yeah.
legitimate, in part because nobody was telling this story in the aftermath.
Hmm.
And the city, unfortunately, has continued that particular dichotomy, and the story of how this happened is so much more complicated, it would take 2 more shows for me to explain it, but they essentially erected a memorial without input from victims like me, despite my advocating and they put me on the committee and then essentially kicked me off the committee and
mm,
built this memorial without input from the neighborhood and without input from
mm,
the wide range of survivors,
mm.
because there's just such I just feel like with the city in particular, there's just this wall that you can't get through, that the physical injuries count and everybody else is just somehow secondary if we think of them at all.
Right. Yeah, I think, that old childhood saying, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. Nothing could be further from the truth, because the words are what inflict the mental and emotional damage, and wounds heal. And people that don't deal in mental health, they don't understand that the wounds heal physically, but the emotional and mental wounds can be there for a lifetime, you know? And it no longer becomes, does this go away? Does this heal? It becomes, how well can we manage it? Is that what you found in your personal journey?
Yes, definitely. And I like that you use the word journey. Early on, I kept waiting for like the switch that now I'm healed.
Mm,
I'm 100% better and life can go back to normal. And I kept thinking, okay, if I just do this therapy or I just work with this therapist, then when it's
right,
all done, I'll be better.
right.
And I was better on a continuum. But I kept using the word better to mean healed and back to
Mm,
my old self.
mhm,
And I kept feeling like I was coming out of a fog. And
mhm,
I'd be like, "Oh, awesome. That fog's behind me. I'm great." And then 3 weeks later, I'd come out of another fog, and you're like, "Oh, okay." And that kept happening before I realized, yeah, that's just gonna keep happening because I am
mm,
getting better,
yeah,
but there's no date on the calendar
right.
is the date that I will be 100% healed, and there's no, like, place in the map that if I can just get there, everything will be perfect. And that switch, that mind switch of realizing that it's a journey and there will be setbacks and there will be huge leaps forward was huge
Mm,
in my healing. Um, because occasionally I am still triggered and now I know how to deal with it and I can
mm,
appreciate that, where it's coming from and that it doesn't mean I'm fully back in the midst of having PTSD again.
right. And the title of today's show is Resilient Living 101. And this word resiliency, I think, it throws people for a loop. The way I view resiliency may be a little bit different than you view it, but I view resiliency as saying, okay, I'm making an active choice today not to go down the path of in the victim role. I'm choosing to live the life of an overcomer and live resiliently. And it's not a perfect journey, but it is a journey. It's one step at a time. It's one day at a time. What is your take on that term resiliency when you use that?
Well, first of all, I have to say I love your take on it. I want to, adopt that as my own. You know, I more than a little bit hate the word resiliency because of how it came into my life.
Mm,
I obviously had heard the word before April 15th, 2013, but not really in the sense of, a character trait or a way that we live our lives. And when I heard about resiliency in respect to overcoming trauma and people who had, been at the bombing, because of where I was, to me, resiliency was something other people had that I didn't have access to. And so it made me really angry to think other
mm,
people had these skills that I didn't have.
mm.
Over time, I realized that I absolutely am resilient and I had some skills, just that they are different than
Yeah.
oth
Everybody's resiliency journey is totally different. It's totally unique to them.
Yes.
Yeah.
And while I still kind of hate the word, I do appreciate the concept. And to me, resiliency has meant, I think, really that recognition that healing from this particular trauma is a journey, and somehow kind of getting that meta level of understanding about how my body and mind deal with these kind of things.
Mm,
So, I've had a lot of practice now for skills like mindfulness and
mm,
doing meditation and doing yoga and being physically active to make sure I'm kind of getting out some of my anxiety.
mm, mm,
All of these things I started doing, thinking of them through the lens of resiliency
mm,
and the lens of how is this going to help me heal? And then kind of realized, oh, hey, I am resilient. I think it's hard to know that you're resilient in the moment
in the
because
moment.
it
Yeah.
kicks in before you know you need it.
Do you remember there being I mean, obviously there was. I mean, we talked about that a little bit. This active choice early on to say, no, got to get back in the saddle, got to get back to normal life. I may feel like I'm numb and I'm going through the motions, but I've got to do this. What, um, I mean, that did happen with you early on, right?
Not exactly in that way.
Yeah.
My early on experience just was, I just have to do this to get through today.
Mm,
I
okay.
just I just
So,
have to.
so when did it click with you? When do you think it clicked?
Brian, I think it was really a couple years at least
Wow. Okay.
before I was able to really recognize that I was healing. I think early on, I it was like, okay, my life has changed and it's horrible and I don't know how to deal with it. And all these things I were doing was that little piece of me that was resilient, saying, call the doctor's office and get an appointment with a therapist.
Hmm.
Reach out
So
to
you were
victims.
being resilient and didn't even realize you were being resilient.
Exactly. It's only
Wow.
in retrospect that I
Okay.
realized I was making some of these choices clearly from a part of me that
Amazing.
knew what to do to heal.
Mm,
And I didn't know that's what was happening until later. Even during that time when I
mm,
was doing these things that were showing that I was resilient was when I heard somebody talking about resiliency and I got so angry because I wasn't resilient.
mhm, mhm. Yeah,
So,
my theory has always been that the mind and the body have this natural desire and ability to pursue healing at all points in time.
mhm,
Now, sometimes we will interfere with that, we'll hold it back,
yes.
but the body and mind, and that is so cool to hear you say that. And I think listeners who've been through any type of trauma, no matter what it is, need to hear that you can't expect in many cases for this to change overnight where you have this epiphany and say, I need to pull myself up by my bootstraps and move on. Sometimes you just need to trust your mind and your body to know that it's going to naturally carry you through that healing process. It sounds like what you did. That is amazing.
Yes. And
Amazing.
I not in the moment, but later have recognized that the fact that after the second bomb went off, I looked straight down at my feet and never looked across the street
Mm,
was 100% my brain and body knowing what they needed to do to protect me,
mm,
or knowing what it needed to do to protect me.
yeah.
And that was not a conscious decision, and it just happened, and I'm grateful for that. I've seen the videos, so I know what I would have been looking at, but it's so different than having seen it in the moment.
Yeah.
And I just think that is so cool to recognize that my brain and my body knew
It
at
is
least
cool.
one thing they could do.
Just intuitively, it just knew what to do to lead you down that path.
Yeah.
That's awesome. So you mentioned mindfulness and meditation and other practices. Are there any tips that you might have for someone who's 3, 4, 5 days or 3, 4, 5 years post trauma and they're still dealing with these issues and kind of beating themselves up? Are there any tips that you can share that have kind of helped you along the way?
The first tip is the uh, try to stop beating yourself up.
Mm,
Uh, we all heal in our own time and in our own way.
mm,
And I think that it is frustrating for me to think, like, I kind of lost 2 years of my life, and
mm,
if you're someone who is, 2, 3, 4, 5 years out from something and you're still feeling distressed, first of all, that's normal. It takes people all sorts of different amounts of time. There's
mm,
no one deadline for everybody.
mhm,
Um, but I think it's important to know that we all have resources that have come to bear to help us, whether we recognize it or not. Like I was just sharing, I didn't really recognize it. And we reach out for help when we get to that point where what we're doing for ourselves doesn't feel like enough.
mm.
So I think, not to beat yourself up that you should have done something sooner or not. If you're feeling like getting help, or if you're feeling like now is the time to make some sort of change, then now is the time to do it, and now is the right time.
I always say, I will not should on myself today. So stop that. And that's beautiful. Yeah. Stop beating yourself up. And I think what I read between the lines there of what you were saying is be patient with yourself and be patient with the process. Be patient with the journey, as hard as it may be.
Yes, and I trust me, know how hard it is. And
Mm,
all of the mindfulness work that I have done is what has helped me be more patient with it.
mm,
I know that that might not be the path that everyone is interested in taking or that would work for everyone, but that is what has given me the patience to ride through the bumpy parts.
mm, mm, mm. Yeah. And any last nuggets or wisdom or advice that you would like to share with anybody who is a survivor of trauma?
I wanna say, first of all, that you're not alone.
Mm,
And if you just wanna look at statistics, like the National Center for PTSD says that 60% of adult men and 50% of adult women will experience at least one trauma in their lives.
yeah,
So if that can help you understand that it is completely normal, and it's normal to be distressed after something horrible happens to
yeah,
you.
yeah.
And I think, what Brian was saying earlier, just be patient. That is the hardest thing
Mm,
to be, but be patient and trust in yourself and the skills that you have built up,
mm,
and that you will do the things that you need to do to get yourself better. And for some people, that means reaching out formally for help, like from a therapist, which is what I did.
mhm,
It doesn't look like that for everybody. People don't always get formal mental health care.
mhm.
Um, yeah, so just trust that if you feel like you need help, then you do, and reach out in a way that feels
Yep,
comfortable for you.
yep. Awesome, awesome. Yeah, the not being in it alone is so critical. And I think that word picture that you created about what happened to you at the moment the bomb went off, and you said someone could have tapped you on your shoulder, but you felt like you were totally alone, like you were the only one around. And I think that's um, a beautiful word picture in the respect that I think that sticks with people throughout their journey is that they do feel alone. And it's important to physically remind yourself, okay, I'm not alone in this. I'm not alone in this. And there is help out there. And there are other people that have been through it. So great, great advice. Is there an interesting project that you're working on right now that you would love to share with us?
Right now I am diving deep into figuring out some of my next speaking topics.
Mhm,
So I talk about trauma sensitive leadership and wanting to find the right audiences. So I'm doing some work right now to kind of make sure I'm telling the right message. You know, my story is my story, and there are some universal pieces to it. But what I want to make sure is that when I'm out there and I'm talking about trauma sensitive leadership and I'm sharing my experience, that I'm finding a way to be helpful. You
Mm,
know, I really want to change how we talk about emotional trauma on
mhm.
all levels. So I'm just digging deep into that right now, trying to get to the next steps.
Awesome. That's a noble mission and a mission worth pursuing, a mission that this world needs, really and truly. Thank you for sharing that.
Thank you.
Um, so I always like to end the show with I call them serious questions, but I'm being very sarcastic. Um, if you had a superpower, what would you most like or envision that superpower to be?
Oh, my superpower would be the ability to travel anywhere in an instant. Um, from a young age, I was such a fan of Bewitched and how she could do that little thing with her nose and
Yeah,
be anywhere in the world. And from a young age, that is what I wanted to do. That
yeah.
would be my superpower.
I think we've anybody from that era, as we are, have lived vicariously through Samantha, that the on Bewitched. So awesome. Um, all I can say is, wow, what an amazing story of overcoming such amazing obstacles and continuing that journey. It's a journey, and that's what people need to hear. It's not a one and done type thing. It's an ongoing journey, and you've turned that energy into something positive and what I know beyond a shadow of a doubt is going to be world changing. Thank you. Thank you for sharing your story. Thank you for sharing your insights and your wisdom. I know there are millions of people who suffer in silence from trauma, and it's unnecessary for them to suffer in silence. And I know your story may be the very hope that they need to make it through another day. Thank you again.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, and I just want to repeat that to anybody who's listening. You are not alone.
Awesome, awesome. Share with our audience how they can follow you or connect with you on social media, on your website. How can they get in touch?
Sure. So my website is me. It's manyachilinski.com. And where I hang out in social media mostly is Twitter. And my username is Manya Chylinski. So would love to touch base with anybody who's interested in this topic.
Sweet, awesome. As we wrap up, I'd like to just remind our listeners that we've started something new here at the Genesis Zone Show. If you'd like to ask a question and have it answered live on my Friday in the Zone segment, then go to www.drbriangBrown.com/question. Click the button in the middle of the page and leave us your question. So that wraps us up. Tune in tomorrow at noon Eastern Standard Time for our In the Zone segment, where I'll be recapping today's interview with Manya Chylinski, sharing how these pearls of wisdom of what Manya has shared from this interview fit into the Genesis Zone advantage. I'll be answering any questions that have come in, and of course, as always, exploring current event topics related to wellness and any other juicy tidbits that I think we need to know. Most informed, most trusted, and most grateful that you spent this time with us today. Until next time, stay in the zone. This is Dr. Brian Brown.